RP if that ever happens. That would depress me. That's totally, that doesn't change. It's only.
Here's my question. You know, the Right to Lifers made an attempt last time to write somebody, and she ended up running as independent.
So behave.
Thank you. So, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Just a few quick notes as we, before we move.
So sorry to interrupt. I can't get you on camera unless you're up there. This area here is a dead zone.
He's not very photogenic.
Sorry about that.
Just a few quick things to say before we turn things over to Ledge Council and what we took off to the bill. We had, I think, we had tough and hard in some ways negotiations with the House, but they were friendly. And I think one of the things that came out of that in a way that might not have been, people might not have understood, is that a real shared understanding developed. And that was really satisfying, that there was this real sense of shared understanding between the two bodies. And we ended up with, of course, what happens with true negotiations. There's something for everybody not to like, and hopefully enough for everybody to like. We were assisted, as people always say in this situation, as they always should, by the incredible work and help of both Legislative Council and JFO. And I have learned not to name names because when I do that, I always leave somebody out. So I really want to say sincerely on behalf of the Senate team, and I'm sure I can even on this one speak for the House as well, thank you to the Legislative Council and JFO for all the work and really remarkable help they gave us throughout. And I also want to thank both teams, both the House team and the Senate team, who worked tirelessly to get to the bill that's now in front of you today, and I think is something we can all be very proud of. I just wanted to hit some of the major features. It retains the cost factor model in its entirety, something that was important to a number of members of this body. The effective date moves to FY29. There are small changes made to the makeup of the State Board of Education. The bill significantly shrinks the number of independent schools eligible to receive tuition, eliminates out-of-state tuition entirely, and eliminates the ability of independent schools to set their own tuition, and does that. It establishes the mapping task force and the ward voting task force. It establishes a framework for state aid to construction, should we find the money to fund the effort. It establishes a new weighting system and also puts in place some significant additional study and analysis of the weights with reports due back, I believe, in December of 26. It has some important transition provisions. It adds second homes as a tax classification, and it develops a new system for primary residential property tax relief. And I think one of the things that the bill does that maybe hasn't gotten a lot of attention is it increases transparency, because one of the issues with the existing law is that virtually nobody understands it. And I'll go into that more maybe this afternoon. But, and it sets us on what will be a long road to filling in all of the pieces that still need to be filled in, all the moving pieces coming together. It sets us on the long road to excellent educational opportunity for every Vermont child. And I think that's the major goal here. We talk about the tax implications a lot and property taxes, but the real goal is for this bill to set us on what will be a long road to getting to the point of offering excellent educational opportunity for every Vermont child. And that we should all keep top of mind. And I think it's something that a lot of us have had top of mind all along. And with that, I will turn it over, I think, to Elizabeth St. James to go first for her sections.
Thank you, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I'm going to go through the first 33 sections, which represent the education policy sections. It's my understanding that what's being asked of Ledge Council as far as this walkthrough goes is to really just highlight the differences between the report of the Committee of Conference and the Senate proposal of amendment without a lot of detail. So stop me if I'm going too fast. So section 1, and then to orient everyone, the Senate proposal of amendment is on the left-hand side of your side-by-side. The report of the Committee of Conference is on the right. Language that appears in the Senate proposal of amendment but does not appear in the report should be highlighted in green, and language that appears in the report but does not appear in the Senate proposal of amendment should be highlighted in yellow. We did our best to get everything, but I can already see places where I wish I had highlighted, so we'll do our best to point those out. So section 1, findings, intent, plan, you can see that the first highlighting doesn't occur until page 3, which means there were no changes, except I found a place where I didn't highlight on page 2, and it's kind of a big one, and that is that it is the intent of the General Assembly in the 2026 session, I'm about 2/3 of the way down, to enact new larger school district boundaries that would be effective July 1, 2026. The Senate proposal of amendment had those new school district boundaries taking effect on July 1, 2027. On page 3, you'll see in the report column that there's, actually you'll see in the Senate proposal of amendment column, a big open white space. That's because all of the language to the right of that is new to the report of the Committee of Conference from the Senate proposal of amendment. That's enacting updates to CTE funding, beginning the process to create voting wards, and establishing an appropriate weight for pre-K students, as well as changes to pre-K funding to ensure that costs are borne by the appropriate funding source depending on the age and the setting of the pre-K provider. In subsection B, we're still on page 3. Another substantive change here is that the Senate proposal of amendment had school board initial member elections occurring in March 2028. The report of the Committee of Conference has those initial elections occurring in November 2027. And then the big one that Senator Bongartz highlighted, the Senate proposal of amendment had those new school districts operational, meaning that they are in charge of the education of their resident students, and all of our current school districts would cease to exist. The Senate proposal of amendment has that taking effect on July 1, 2029. The report of the Committee of Conference has that taking effect on July 1, 2028. There's also a new piece of intent language at the very bottom of page 3, and then taking up all of page 4 and about 2/3 of page 5, related to tax rates and tax bills, and not wanting to increase either of those things. And the intent language is essentially a list of all of the items that do that in this bill. And that is language that is new to the report of the Committee of Conference. Section 2, I'm on the very bottom of page 5, the Commission on the Future of Public Education. The Senate proposal of amendment largely adopted largely cut out most of the commission's work, and the report of the Committee of Conference does as well. You'll see that the main changes occur on page 9. The Senate proposal of amendment kept the commission's current charge related to the roles of the Agency of Education, the roles of the State Board of Education, what should be local control, what should be state control. And you'll see right to the right of that on page 9, all of that yellow language is struck because the report of the Committee on Conference removes all of the current language related to policy considerations and puts in some new language starting on page 10. So the report of the Committee of Conference now is required to report back to you all with recommendations, necessary updates to the roles and responsibilities of school boards and the electorate. On page 11, a process for a community served by a school to have a voice in decisions regarding school closures and recommendations for what that process shall entail. That piece actually was very similar, if not substantially the same as language that did appear in the Senate proposal of amendment. And then the last charge to the Commission on the Future of Public Education is a process, recommendations regarding a process for monitoring implementation of this act in a manner that is transparent and public facing. That's at the bottom of page 11. The rest of the changes to the Commission on the Future of Public Education remain the same. We're going to go to section 3, which starts at the very bottom of page 14, but substantive.
We don't have page numbers on ours.
Oh, you don't?
Upper left-hand corner.
Sorry, I take it all back. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we're in section 3 now. The school district redistricting task force. The concept of a standalone committee to look at and recommend to you all boundaries for new school districts is a concept that came out of the Senate. You all had a standalone body. And so the report of the committee and conference adopts that, but the membership is different. You'll see green and yellow on page 15. So the membership in the report of the committee of conference version is 5 non-legislative members and 6 legislative members. And then the duties and charge. So in general, the task force is required to work with the future of public education and recommend to you all not more than 3 options for proposed school district boundaries. At least 1 boundary proposal has to consider the use of supervisory unions and supervisory districts, allow for the continuation of tuitioning system, et cetera. All of that language appears the same in the Senate proposal of amendment. And then the rest of it, all of the concepts and topics that this task force is required to consider is truly a mix of language from the House and the Senate. And so you'll see a little bit of highlighting here and there where language was taken from the House passed version. But if the language is not highlighted on the right-hand column, it means it came directly from the Senate version. Some other changes here is we added the Department of Taxes as providing assistance to the task force. I'm on page 18 now. The deliverables remain the same, a report and maps. The language that needs to appear on the maps that you all get is taken largely from the House, which is why it's highlighted in yellow, although those concepts did exist in the Senate version, just not in the same language. The other big changes to this section are the appropriations, and I will just let those speak for themselves in the interest of time. The task force is allowed to hire 1 or more consultants, and so that is what part of those appropriations are for. Section 4 on page 19, school district voting board task force remains the same as passed the House. It is completely different than what passed the Senate. You all passed a transitional school board concept, and the House and then the Committee of Conference adopted the concept of a working group to recommend to you all voting wards that would be proportional representation based on the work of the task force. I'm going to skip over sections where there was no change. Is that good? Okay. So we're going to move to page 23. Which is section 6, education quality standards. This is class size minimums. The report of the Committee of Conference largely adopted the Senate proposal of amendment related to class size minimums with one exception, and that is kindergarten is excluded from class size minimums in the report. The next section where we see changes is on page 27, section 8. This is a section that requires the State Board of Education to update some rules based on various changes throughout the bill. One piece that was not in the Senate proposal of amendment that is in the report of Committee of Conference is asking the State Board to update the education quality standards rules with statewide graduation requirements. We're going to move to page 28, section 9 of the report of the Committee of Conference. This is a similar section to the State Board. Now we're looking at the Agency of Education. The language that remains unchanged from the Senate proposal of amendment is a bunch of reports back to you all, but the language that's highlighted in yellow is related to graduation requirements. So asking the Agency of Education to make recommendations to the State Board for what those graduation requirements shall be. And then another big substantive difference is that the report requires the Agency of Education to adopt a statewide school calendar. So we're going to skip a whole bunch of pages now, and we're going to go to page 36, section 16. We're in the middle of the state aid for school construction sections. We're skipping all over everything above section 16 because there were no changes. But in section 16, the state aid for school construction aid special fund, the Senate passed version had the fund being consisting of any amounts deposited in the fund from the supplemental district spending reserve. You'll see that language is missing from the report of the Committee of Conference, and that is because the funds from the supplemental district spending reserve are now being used for a different purpose, and John will get to that in his section. Section 17, there is a very small change in this section. So you can jump to section or on page 41. This is the section regarding how awards are calculated for state aid for school construction. And on the very top of page 41, there's language added to the subdivision about the award of construction aid, which remains the same as a base amount of award is 20% of eligible debt service cost of a project. Oh.
I'll make sure you're not on June 13th either.
Oh, boy. Okay. Sure. Thanks.
Which date are you doing? Two dates.
I have June 14th. We don't have to debate it. I can just make someone else's copy.
No, because some of us have June 14th and some of us have June 13th. We had different copies here. I think you had the June 14th one, which is the more recent one. So Senator Baruch, do you have June 13th?
The date.
You have 14th.
We both have June 14th, but different page numbers.
Oh, interesting.
all-
So there are three different versions that have been passed out.
Two sections, yeah.
Okay, so we are in section 17, thank you. This is approval and funding of school construction projects. Again, this is the section that talks about applications, what's considered, how the money goes out, et cetera. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages after the start of that section, right before section 18, is the one substantive change. And that is in subdivision 6, where it says amounts shall be awarded annually. The language "and are subject to an annual appropriation for the purposes of this program" has been added. The next section where there are changes is section 21. These are amendments to section 828 in Title 16, which is entitled Tuition to Approved Schools. This is the statute that tells us what schools school districts can pay tuition to. So the change, this section is largely adopted from the Senate proposal of amendment. Oh. There's missing, okay. I'm gonna borrow that. I hope it's better. Nope. There's a large change in this section that is not accounted for here. So I will figure out how to get that information to you all. But for what we have in section 21, the student enrollment, on subdivision 2D, a requirement for an approved independent school to be eligible to receive public tuition. One of the criteria that needs to be met is that needs to have had at least 25% of its student enrollment composed of students attending on a district-funded basis. The 25% remains the same as the Senate passed, or the Senate proposal of amendment. The Senate proposal of amendment had that 25% tied to Vermont resident student enrollment, and the report of the Committee of Conference has that 25% tied to overall student enrollment. And there is a very large substantive piece that is missing from this section that I will get to you all, and we will walk through it before we leave this room. I'm going to jump to section 23. It looks like there's a change here, but I just collapsed two different intent sections. So there's really, the language appears just not in the Senate version, just not in one section. No changes until we get to section, oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of the wrong statute. Section 21 is good. You have all the information. Strike that from the record. Section 22 7 is what I was thinking of. So section 27 is the section that tells us how to calculate tuition. So subsection A remains the same as passed the Senate. Tuition's calculated in a future state, and we'll talk about the effective dates in a second. Base and weights apply to each student, and that's what the student takes with them for tuition. But the report of the Committee of Conference adds a couple subsections. So subsection B allows a receiving school to charge an additional fee of up to 5% of the base for every student attending the receiving school in grades 9 through 12, only if the following conditions are met. The receiving school has received approval from the state board to charge the fee, and the electorate of each school district with at least one student attending the receiving school has approved supplemental district spending for the purpose of this subsection and in an amount sufficient to cover the additional fee. Subdivision 2 tells us that the receiving school, for the purposes of this section, a receiving school does not include an approved independent school in Vermont functioning as a CTE center. Subsection C tells us that a receiving school that elects to charge that additional fee must charge the same fee to each school district. It cannot charge different fees to different school districts. And subsection D allows a school district or requires a school district to pay the full tuition charge to students attending an approved independent school in Vermont functioning as an approved area career and technical center. And that language is actually current law. Section 28A in the report of the Committee of Conference is brand new. It requires the State Board of Education to adopt rules to govern the additional fee analysis that it is required to do. So one of the contingencies that need to be met for a receiving school to be able to charge that fee, extra fee for high school students, is that the State Board has granted approval. Section 28A asks the State Board to adopt rules that govern that approval process, and that those rules need to require a receiving school to demonstrate that the additional fee is necessary to educate the specific students the fee is being applied to, and that the fee will be used to educate such students and not used to shift costs elsewhere within the applicable school's budget. The section 27 has two different contingent effective dates. Subsections A and D, so the tuition fee that would, or the tuition amount that would apply to every student, base and weights. And subsection D, paying full tuition to an approved independent school that's functioning as a CTE, area CTE center. Those two subsections take effect on July 1, 2028, contingently if three things are met. Your new school districts are operational. You've received the 45A report, which John will go over, which is a report back to you all related to the foundation formula with some updated analysis. And you all, the General Assembly has been given an opportunity to enact updates related to the information it receives from that 45A report. Subsections B and C related to the fee are also contingently effective on July 1, 2028. But their contingency, those subsections contingencies are also new school districts are operational. You've received the 45A report and it contains evidence that it costs more to educate secondary students, and you have failed to enact secondary student weights. Those are the contingencies for subsections B and C. Section 29, there's one very small change here at the very end of the section, so right below, above section 30. This is a report back to you all related to the provision of special education and special education funding and the costs and services associated with that. The report of the Committee of Conference adds a requirement for that report to include recommendations for reducing the growth of extraordinary special education reimbursement costs, which shall include recommended legislative language to accomplish any such recommendations. The only other changes in the sections that I am responsible for, the last change occurs in section 32, and that is just updating the appropriation amounts to the Agency of Education for its transformation appropriations. And those, the overall appropriation to the agency is updated to be $2,865,000. The appropriation for school board transitions and positions remain the same, and then the contracted services appropriation would then be $2,102,500. Those numbers were updated to reflect updates throughout the bill related to different appropriations, all coming out of the same pot of money. And that's it for me.
Hello, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. We're going to switch gears a little bit, jump into education finance sections. And so we start with section 34. I am going to speak a little bit to each section very quickly, even if there are no changes, just for tracking purposes. So section 34, while there's no change proposed by the conference committee report, know that this is your section that sets out the base amount of that $15,033 per pupil. Section 35 is your weighting section, and there's really two changes proposed here, one to the weights and one related to recalibration. So what you're going to see first is an update in the definitions portion of section 35 that's related to child with a disability. That's your special education category. And while these look quite different between the columns, the sole substantive difference between these two definitions is that child with a disability in the conference committee report speaks to those who are enrolled in any of K through 12, meaning that a pre-K student would not be eligible to receive a special education weight as proposed here. You're going to see further down highlighting related to pupils in pre-K, pupils in kindergarten through grade 5 and the like. This is just the counting section of the weighting section. You can think of the weighting section as divided into multiple tasks. We have to tally up the pupils who fall within particular categories, and then we apply particular weights to those categories. So what you're seeing here in the conference committee report is that we'll maintain counting for the grade levels themselves, irrespective of whether weights would be applied. The substantive change to the weights comes to in subsection D. This is where the start of the application of the weights. In the Senate proposal amendment, you had no grade level weights provided. In the conference committee report, what you see is maintaining existing law pre-K weight of negative 0.54. So that's actually a reduction in the amount. That is the sole substantive change to the weights themselves. You're going to see some stylistic changes throughout to add subsection headers for readability, things like this is your economic disadvantage weight and the like. But the real substantive change to this section is that adding the pre-K weight of negative 0.54. The other change that you're going to see in this section is to subsection H. This is your recalibration portion. There's a regular recalibration of the inputs to the foundation formula on a 5-year basis. And what you see proposed in the conference committee report is that this recalibration would be done with the advice and consultation of a professional judgment panel convened by AOE. The next section is section 36. No change here. This is really a conforming change section, removing existing law concepts and replacing with references to EOP and your supplemental district spending. Section 37 is support grants that are provided to small schools and sparse schools. You will recall from the weighting section that existing law, small school, and sparsity weights have been removed. They've been replaced with the support grants structure. The concept that you see in the conference committee report is quite similar to what the Senate passed. The real difference is in the definition of sparse area. You're going to see that in the Senate proposal amendment, we reference a geographic area corresponding to a zip code. And what you see in the conference committee report is updating the geographic area for determining that sparsity determination to be city, town, or incorporated village. And this is another way of trying to get at a school that is located within a sparse area. You're also going to see duplicated for the sparse school definition. That's sub 4. That's similar to small schools, which has a substantive check, right? It has that fewer than 100 pupils, but it also requires a state board determination. We have a similar concept proposed for sparse schools. So the sparse school needs to be within that sparse area. That's that city, town, or incorporated village. And additionally, it needs to be determined by the state board to be sparse by necessity under standards, under sections that Beth walked through. I should pause here and say that you're going to see highlighting at the top of each section related to the effective dates themselves, and this is something to flag, just the timeline is different, right? In the Senate proposal of amendment, that had been an FY30 foundation formula rollout, and what you see here is an FY29 foundation formula rollout, so it's 1 year faster in this proposal. Section 38, no changes proposed in the Conference Committee report. This is just updates to the Ed Fund to pick up your SDS revenue. Similar sections 39 and 40, no changes proposed in the Conference Committee report. Some of that is cleanup changes and some of it is conforming, striking existing education concepts and replacing with the new EOP references. Section 41, this is your budget vote. So this sets out the form of the budget that would go out to school districts. As you know, under the foundation formula, you're not having a vote on that foundation amount, on that EOP, but you are having a vote locally if folks want to raise additional funds. That's your supplemental district spending. And so what you see here is the ballot that's provided for that. The changes that you see here are really conforming changes related to sections elsewhere in the bill. So the differences you see is that in the Senate proposal of amendment, there had been no reference to the property tax classifications. We need to reference the rate differently if you have the classifications as contemplated here. So that's what you see, the reference to the anticipated statewide education tax rate as adjusted for each tax classification. It's conforming to the tax classification pieces later in the bill, but otherwise this section looks just like what you saw from the Senate proposal of amendment. Section 42 is sets of conforming repeals related to the other foundation formula changes, but you do see some new additions to the repeals. So in subsection D, you see a repeal of the categorical aid pieces related to English learners services. This is related to that inclusion of the EL weight. So you can think of this as just a conforming change for that piece, something that hadn't been thought about so much until we got to the conference committee. And similarly, the merger support grants, which is your subsection E, it's a concept that wouldn't make sense with the new school district boundaries, so you can repeal those provisions. Section 43, this is something that that Beth alluded to earlier. This is your supplemental district spending reserve. This is the bucket in the Ed Fund that captures any extra funds recapture that are raised through your supplemental district spending equalization measure. And the change that you see is in subsection C, which covers what is done with the funds at the end of the fiscal year if you still have any remaining after accounting for mathematical errors. In the Senate proposal amendment, those went to the School Construction Aid Special Fund. But what you see in Section 43 in the Conference Committee report is that those would be, instead of transferred to the School Construction Aid Special Fund, they would flow up to the Ed Fund. They would be pulled out of that reserve, and they would be made available in the following year to decrease the following year's statewide education property tax rates. So using the equalization measure to reduce following year property taxes. Sections 44 and 45 are the same. These are reports from AOE and JFO related to transportation reimbursement, inflationary measures, and pre-K. Section 45A is the foundation formula report, and this is one of the pieces on which the contingent effective dates ride, is this particular foundation formula. And the changes that you see in this section are that JFO would contract with one or more contractors. So you're going to see a boost in the appropriation as well, ensuring that the money that's made available is such that there's not just one person who could satisfy this particular criterion. You could hire multiple contractors. So JFO would contract with one or more contractors with expertise in Vermont's education funding system to recommend updates to the foundation formula, to move from special education weights based on disability categories, you'll remember that category A, B, C, based on costs, to a reliance on the provision of special education services, and to update any other weights as necessary under that recommendation, taking into account the cost savings generated by new, larger consolidated school districts. In addition to that report, the contractors would make recommendations on a couple of pieces. One is familiar from the Senate proposal amendment. That's what is the right basis for determining sparsity. We have a proposal here including that town, city, incorporated village, but is that the best measure of sparsity? Additionally, looking at whether it costs more to educate a secondary student, and if so, providing an appropriate weight to capture that cost differential. Lastly, how to account for the provision of CTE within Vermont's foundation formula, which is something that shows up in a couple of places in the bill, re-examining CTE or looking at CTE in the upcoming year. These would be provided to committees of jurisdiction December 1, 2026, and you can see a boosted appropriation of $400K, making available more contractors for this particular purpose. Lastly, a substantive piece of this in subsection D is that the contractors would be required to train JFO and AOE in those methodologies so that they could recalibrate under the weighting section. Without knowing those methodologies, you can't possibly do the recalibration. Section 45B is, these are transitionary measures for your EOP, but additionally related to tuition, so I'll talk about that. The highlights that you see in subsection A are just related to the different timeline that's proposed here, right? It's a rollout starting in FY29 rather than in FY30, so those are the highlights you see. But in subsection B, you see in the conference committee report proposed a tuition transitionary measure. If you think about what the section is doing, it's adjusting across the first 5 years of the foundation formula rollout, educational opportunity payment that's provided. And so what you need to do if you think about money following the student for tuitioning purposes is that tuition needs to pick up the adjusted EOP in each of those first 5 years. So that's what you have in subsection B, is that tuition would be adjusted to reflect that adjusted EOP so that in your FY 33, everyone's on the same page. You're all at the EOP, you're all fully transitioned to the standard tuitioning measures. Section 45C, this is just delaying the start of the Ed Fund Advisory Committee when its first meeting is called. That had been proposed in 2027 in the Senate Proposal Amendment, and that's accelerated to July 15th, 2026 in the Conference Committee report. Section 46, we're now jumping out of Title 16 and pieces that are just within the ed world, and we're jumping to taxation. This is going to be your section that covers supplemental district spending and the like. I do want to call out the highlighting you see in the struck through language. You don't need to worry about. This is just making sure that we're referencing the correctly effective underlying language that's being removed at the time that this would become effective. That's your FY 29. Because those changes, those sections are changing in the upcoming years, this is just a correction from editing to make sure it's referencing those correctly. The real substantive additions you see statewide adjustment highlighted. You'll recall statewide adjustment is done to account for the effects of the CLA on folks' rates. That's being studied here, so it's included in the future foundation formula. You would still have that statewide adjustment present. You see this definition for adjusted equalized education property tax grand list. This is a measure that's included for the equalization measures of the supplemental district spending yield. You can think of this as a cleanup change, something that could have been thought about before. This adjusted equalized education property tax grand list is trying to get at the actual taxing capacity of a district that's made available for its local vote. And so it needs to account for the application of the homestead exemption, right? If you don't account for that, then you're over accounting for the amount of property that's actually available for taxation purposes. So that's what the adjusted equalized education property tax grand list does, is it captures the actual taxing capacity of those districts after application of the homestead exemption. And you're going to see that the definition of school district with the lowest taxing capacity picks up that adjusted change. And similarly, at the very end of this section, you see that the definition of supplemental district spending yield picks up the application of the statewide adjustment. So maintaining current law statewide adjustment in the future foundation formula. Section 46A is a new provision to transition the actual cap that is applied. And just to, if you look back up at section 46 and you look at subdivision 22, you'll see that there's a cap included on the supplemental district spending that's been reduced from 10% down to 5%. So once all the transitionary measures are done, the cap on supplemental district spending would be 5% of an unweighted base times LTM. 46A is providing a transition for that cap. So in the first years of the foundation formula, the first 5 years, until everyone's fully transitioned to their EOP in FY33, that cap would be set at 10% to account for the first years. And then gradually it would be brought down so that in fiscal year 2038, you would hit that 5% statutory cap on SDS. Section 47 is the application of the statewide rate and the supplemental district spending tax rate. What you're seeing highlighted in the conference committee report is that the assumptions that are built into setting the rate sufficient to cover expenditures from the Ed Fund need to account for the updates that we made to the supplemental district spending reserve. And so you'll recall that instead of those funds, the recapture flowing to school construction aid special fund, they would be made available to the following years buying down tax rates. That's what's picked up here, is that in setting that rate, you need to account for any funds unreserved in the Ed Fund under that process. Additionally, what you see is that the default rate is set here. What happens if if the General Assembly fails to pass a statewide education tax rate? If there's failure to adopt so, the statewide education tax rate would be the product of 110% and the statewide education tax rate for the preceding fiscal year. So you can think of it as a 10% penalty on top of the preceding year. So it's meant to be an incentive to get folks to pass a education tax rate. You'll be familiar with the highlighting that you see here in the table. This maintains the property tax classifications with one change, but you're going to set a statewide education tax rate, and that would be adjusted for different classifications of property. And the classifications you see are homestead, non-homestead, non-residential, and non-homestead residential. You'll recall, and Kirby's going to touch on this, but the House provisions included an additional non-homestead category for apartments. The remaining changes here, I'm going to flip through pretty quickly. These are conforming changes for applying the statewide adjustment and referencing that statewide rate that is adjusted by category rather than having distinct homestead and non-homestead like existing law. So I think we can jump to section 48, which is your December 1 letter. So this is the recommendation setting of the statewide education tax rate. This is really just conforming changes in these sections here. This is picking up that it's going to be one statewide education tax rate that's adjusted, and then that's going to be divided by the statewide adjustment, so maintaining existing law statewide adjustment measures moving forward. Additionally, in subsection D, for setting the supplemental district spending yield, we need to pick up the actual taxing capacity of the district, so that's why you see updates to include adjusted equalized education property tax grant lists. Section 48A is your transitionary measures for your homestead property tax rate. Much like the transitionary measures we saw before, you're going to see highlighting that references the years. So this is starting a year earlier, so that's why you see highlighting there. But there is a substantive change to the section beyond just a one-year accelerated timeline. In subsection C, you can see that on or before December 15th, 2027, tax in consultation with JFO and AOE would submit a report to committees of jurisdiction with a recommendation and implementation plan to ensure that education property tax rates don't increase as part of the transition to the new foundation formula. Section 49, there's no change. This is just conforming changes tied to that statewide rate. Similar for section 40, the changes that you see highlighted just reflect pieces that Kirby's going to speak to, which is referencing a statewide rate adjusted by classification rather than just non-homestead and homestead. Section 51, we're jumping now to the repeal of the property tax credit and the creation of the homestead exemption. Your section 51 just sets out statutory purposes, no change there. Section 52 is the actual creation of the homestead exemption. There's going to be a couple changes in before you see, a couple pages in before you see the changes. And they come in by statute. The section is section 6066, and you're going to see a wall of highlighting, so it should be pretty recognizable. The homestead exemption is set out in a set of tables that provide income brackets and percentages. What you're seeing in the Conference Committee report is largely the House proposed homestead exemption, so their proposed set of income brackets and percentages, but adopts the Senate cap of the exemption being made available against the first $425,000 in house site value. So it includes the cap that the Senate had proposed on its own concept. The one change that you'll see relative to the House's original proposal is that there once was a $3,000 income bracket, and that's been smoothed out, so you have cleaner income brackets here, essentially. We can, after that, flip pretty quickly. It's conforming changes through the remainder of this section just to pick up the statewide rate reference. And we can jump all the way to section 53. What you're seeing in section 53 in the Conference Committee report is condensing the Senate proposal amendment sections 53 and 53A into one section. These both relate to the homestead exemption. You see a deadline of December 15th of 2026. So next year, Department of Tax is to submit a proposal designing a homestead exemption that could be used in place of what we just walked through. So if they could come up with a better proposal that minimizes property tax impacts, benefit cliffs, and additionally with that proposal, what you see newly added is an analysis of the implications of moving to income sensitivity measures that provide benefits to households with household income of up to $175K. So could that homestead exemption be moved up to a higher income bracket, and what would be required to do that? Section 54 through 56 are conforming changes related to the property tax credit repeal. And then section 50, and there are no changes there. And then section 57 is a few limited updates to the directives for the Ed Fund Advisory Committee. Some of the changes that you're seeing here are just picking up the new foundation formula that would be in place at the point that this examination is occurring. So updating weighting factors in light of the foundation formula, updating the income sensitivity in light of the homestead exemption rather than the PTC. And then the new provisions that you see at the very end of this in I and J, how to maintain intra-district equity under Vermont's foundation formula and whether weighted foundation formula payments are leading to improved outcomes across all populations, so accounting for that weighting. In the Senate proposal amendment for sections 58 and 59, there was a contingent, and this is differently contingent than the other sections. This had no specific date. This was your potential future transition to an evidence-based foundation formula. Those sections have simply been deleted. And with that, I am good to turn it over to Kirby.
Okay. Kirby Keaton, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to walk through the last sections for you. We start with the concept for creating a tax classification system in the future. The Senate version of things had wanted to study that, so there was just a study. What the report of the Committee of Conference has is a return to the House language, but with some tweaks to it for that concept. So we start in section 60, which is the definition or the statute on the grand list. That reverts back to the House's version of things, except that this section and the next section are now contingent on the new school district system becoming operational before tax classifications take effect. Previously, it was going to just happen based on a date. Getting into section 61 of the report, as John mentioned, there's the removal of the apartment classification, which the House had proposed, which leaves you with just one new tax classification, which is non-homestead residential. You can think of that as residential properties that are not being used as homesteads. So that could be second homes, short-term rentals, vacant properties, things like that. There's also a new definition, which is not highlighted in the document here, but I would draw your attention to subdivision 3 on, at least for my document, page 104, which is a new definition for non-homestead residential. This is a much broader definition than the House language. It leaves a lot of the definition up to the Department of Taxes to create through rule. It's anticipated that when this is revisited next session, that the definitions will be changed and that will be fleshed out more. And then we have section 61A, which is the transition to this new classification system. This is moved up a year to 2027. And there's also a contingency added for this section. The Department of Taxes won't do the work it needs to do to transition to the new system unless maps are created to create new districts next session. So that's the change there. 61B is the property classifications implementation report, which is from the House language. There's a subsection B added to that. So if you see on page at least 106, if you have the same thing that I have, that the Department of Taxes will come back next year and suggest some multipliers, these multipliers that John had mentioned for setting up new numbers, factors to multiply the tax rate by for each classification. So one of these multipliers that the department will come back with would be one that has the non-homestead residential properties, the second homes category, to pay for the homestead exemption, the new homestead exemption that John went over. And another set of numbers that the department will come back with would be to cover any or to mitigate any forecasted property tax increases on homestead property taxpayers under the new system. And then we have section 61C, which is new. It's just an intent section stating that when the multipliers are considered in the future, that the General Assembly will also reevaluate the entire tax classification concept. That's something that you'll have to do, so there's not a lot of legal weight to that section. 61D is a prospective repeal of the tax classifications, and this is a contingency that states that if things fall apart here and the new system doesn't become operational and tax rate multipliers specifically are not put into law in the next session or two, that the tax classification concept does not take effect. That brings us to section 62, which relates to regional property assessment, the creation of regional assessment districts. The only change from the Senate version there is that everything was moved up a year, so that would take effect in 2029. In section 63, that's the transition to the regional assessment districts. That's exactly the same as the Senate passed version. Section 64 is the regional assessment district stakeholder working group, which was not changed at all. And the rest of the sections 65 through 69 are miscellaneous provisions with a lot of technical fixes, and it's the same as the Senate version. And there's your bill.
So I think while we have Ledge Council and JFO here, it's great if you have questions of them.
And then questions of the conference committee, maybe we save for the afternoon when we may not have Ledge Council and JFO. Sunshine?
May I ask a question of, I think it would be John Gray? I don't see, oh, great. So it's regarding section 47 and the default tax rate of 110% should a future legislature fail to act. I'm curious, what other practices or standards can you refer to where we have that in place? And I just want to cite that my understanding was when a school district's budget fails, they get to borrow up to 85% of the previous year. And I'm also curious with the yield bill, if we didn't pass a yield bill, what does that default to? I'm just curious where the 110%, the automatic increase comes from, and what standard or comparisons we have in state government to do such a thing. The last thing I'll say, just to sort of lead the question a little bit more, I just remember Senator Mazza, when I contemplated such a notion about automatically increasing fees so that we wouldn't have to deal with a fee bill every 3 years, that was poo-pooed right off the bat as something that would take away the power of future legislatures. So could you tell me more about the 110% and normalize it for me?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, is that section 47?
Section 47 of the Committee of Conference report.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big section, and so it'll be highlighted later. This is just before the table, there was see that in there. But the thinking here is that in the absence of a default provision, you have no default rate. So what if the legislature fails to pass any statewide education tax rate? In that case, you're not funding education. So that is an option. You could have no default rate. The thinking here was what kinds of options to provide that maybe provide less risk than those not funding any education. And so the thinking was you need to create something that is sufficiently strong incentive to get folks to pass an education tax rate. But you couldn't avail yourself, like in the current system, which I think part of what you're asking for. In the current system, you have a callback for the yield to prior year yield. So you would have that piece to reference. Part of the mechanics in the existing system are that because you have a statutory homestead and non-homestead rate to actually reference, right? They aren't just set, like in this bill, sufficient to cover expenditures. You actually have a process that's built out in law for those pieces, and it's included to account for the variation in the homestead rate. You have basically technical provisions in the existing system that mean that to an extent, the fallback you would have accounts for some variation. It doesn't account for that year's variation, but it would account for some variation. You don't have that luxury in the new system, which is just setting the statewide education tax rate sufficient to cover expenditures from the ed fund. Right, that's the sole directive for what that rate is. So some provision was to be included to set a fallback rate, and the thinking was that 110% of last year's would be sufficient to spur folks to do that. You could choose any sort of default rate, right? And it's just a choice of what the backup is going to be. But of course, the intention, as I understand it, is that you hope never to have to rely on a fallback rate, because what that means is that the legislature has failed to set a statewide education tax rate.
I'll just close by saying I heard you say it's an incentive for a future legislature to act. I could also see a perverse incentive to inhibit a future legislature from acting to default the tax rate to a higher percentage amount. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
This may be a basic question, and I'm looking at Kirby because I think it was in your section, but in our district, we've had situations where the non-homestead rate has been a much lower rate than the homestead tax rate, and I'm not totally sure how this bill would impact that situation. Because it sounds like we're making new categories, but we're also changing some other pieces. So if you could just tell me what happens in that world.
As far as tax rates go under this, there's the multipliers I mentioned. And those are set at 1.0 right now.
Yeah.
So in the future, you would decide to increase or decrease those for different classifications. The three classifications would be homestead, non-homestead, non-residential, which is what's left over after you take out the non-homestead residential.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it does.
So,
Yep.
so that would
yeah,
be,
that's
that would
page
be the rate.
81 is kind of what you're talking about, yeah, on our thing.
And so if that's your concern, then yeah, you'll, in the future, it's thought that you can adjust those.
Okay.
The overall tax liability, once that's, applied to the property value, could mean
Different outcomes. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And with a factor of 1, it would mean that for now, if you've made no change, they would be the same.
Okay.
They'd be the same, right.
That's helpful.
That's New York State.
Thank you.
But if we're going to note that, I should note There were sections, that if you don't set new rate multipliers though, that's one of the contingencies to not do tax classifications. Like if you wanted to keep it at 1.0 or if you make no changes to those multipliers in future sessions, then that repeal that I went over could kick in. And because it would be seen as you don't want to do it anymore if you don't want to tax those differently. Does that make sense?
It does,
Okay.
as a concept, yes. Thank you.
Kirby, a similar section, I think it's 61B, the commission shall recommend these tax rates. So I didn't understand the difference between 1 and 2. Are they setting 2 different sets of tax rates? And they're not, is there a relation between 1 and 2, or is it the rate supposed to both cover the revenue and also, both, does it have to meet 1 and 2, or they're just 2 separate rates that are not related to each other?
So this is what we were talking about before with the multipliers. The department will recommend 2 different sets, and then it would be up to the General Assembly to do something with that information. So this is not going to affect the law. This will just give you options.
But they're unrelated, the 2 sets.
They would cover different things.
Right.
Like one would be a set that would cover just paying for the homestead exemption. The other would be paying for all additional costs to homestead taxpayers.
Good.
And this would be for Attorney St. James. And I'm sorry, I wasn't here when you went over this, so you might have covered it, but I'm talking about section 21, tuition to approved schools. And when you go down to sub A to E, one of the requirements is that the school complies with minimum class size requirements contained in subdivision 165 sub A9 of Title 16. That doesn't exist until the year after that goes into effect. So what impact would that have on payment to schools when it doesn't exist?
So the class size minimum, 165A9 is section.
I think it's section 6.
I'm the loudest of the 3. I you couldn't pick me up, but you could get, okay.
Now you're all the way up there. I believe it's section 6, but
Yep.
that goes into effect July 1st of 2026.
Yes.
Whereas what I'm talking about goes into effect in less than a month.
That is a great point. So
when that happens, what do they do?
it's a great question.
Okay.
I mean, that's just something that I think I overlooked in all of our activity over the last several months and days and weeks. I think realistically, if that law does not exist, then there is nothing for them to comply with yet.
So therefore they comply. That's what I was hoping
Yep.
that you would say.
The other piece to that, the practical piece to that, is that compliance with class size minimums, if you fail to comply with class size minimums, repercussions don't start unless it's 3 consecutive years. And it's a may, not a shall. So, but thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, thanks.
If there are no further questions, I will suggest that we thank profusely our Ledge Council and Joint Fiscal folks, and then we've gavelled out until 2:30. So that gives time, if you have questions for anybody, to get them answered, and we will be back here at 2:30. Yes? Sorry, I thought we were done.
Maybe this is a stupid question, but the exemptions or credits that are baked into the bill, I know they don't cover necessarily the entire portion of the value of the home site, but does it cover the entire home site in like physical acreage? And how would this interact with like current use or farms or?
Sure. So the exemption, much like the existing property tax credit, is tied to house site which is a subset of what you can think of as homestead, right? Homestead would pick up your dwelling and it'd have the parcel. House site is the dwelling, but the 2 acres around, so it's circumscribed. It's a more limited provision. It is consistent with the way that income sensitivity measures are dealt with today with the property tax credit. So it's not making a shift in that approach to what house site is for purposes of the income sensitivity. It's just shifting from a PTC to an exemption. So it would depend on where it falls within that 2 acre. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.